In the summer of 1845, two of the most advanced ships in the world sailed out of England and into the Arctic. They carried 129 men, reinforced iron hulls, steam engines, and enough provisions for years. They were commanded by a celebrated officer, Sir John Franklin. Their mission was to complete the Northwest Passage, the sea route across the top of North America that had defeated explorers for 3 centuries. Two whaling ships spotted them in Baffin Bay that July, waiting for the ice to open, and then they were gone. All of them, both ships and every single man. What followed was one of the largest search efforts in maritime history. Dozens of expeditions, decades of searching, enormous rewards offered. And for more than a century and a half, the fate of the Franklin expedition remained the great unsolved mystery of Arctic exploration. Except, and this is the part that still stings, it wasn't unsolved. Because within a few years of the disappearance, the Inuit of the Central Arctic began telling searchers exactly what had happened, where the ships went, how the men died, where one vessel sank. They described it in detail repeatedly to anyone who asked. And for 170 years, the people searching for those ships did not believe them. Today, we're examining the historical records, the testimony, and what happened in 2014 when a search team finally decided to take the Inuit at their word. To understand why this story matters, you have to understand the scale of what was thrown at the problem. When the Franklin expedition failed to return, the British Admiralty launched a search effort unlike anything before it. Franklin's wife, Lady Jane Franklin, campaigned relentlessly, funding voyages with her own money and pressuring the government into more. Rewards were offered, ships were sent from Britain and America. Over the following decades, dozens of expeditions combed the Arctic. They found fragments. 3 graves on Beechy Island from the expedition's first winter, abandoned equipment. And in 1859, on King William Island, a single sheet of paper in a stone cairn, the only written record ever recovered from the expedition. It reported that the ships had been trapped in ice, that Franklin had died in June of 1847, and that in April of 1848, the survivors had abandoned the vessels and set out on foot across the ice toward the mainland. That was it. That was everything the searchers had in writing. But it was not everything that was known. Because in 1854, 5 years before that note was found, a Scottish surveyor named John Ray had already learned the essentials, not by searching the ice, but by talking to people. Ray worked for the Hudson's Bay Company, and unlike most British explorers, he had spent years learning Arctic survival from the Inuit themselves. He traveled light, hunted for his food, and could speak with the people he met. In the spring of 1854, on the Boothia Peninsula, Ray encountered Inuit who told him about a group of about 40 white men who had died of starvation some years earlier, near a large river to the west. They had objects taken from the site, silver cutlery, a medal, items that plainly came from the expedition, and they described with reluctance the condition in which the last of the men had been found. Ray reported it all faithfully to the Admiralty, including the final terrible detail that the evidence indicated the last survivors had been driven to cannibalism. And that is where this story becomes about something more than missing ships. Before we continue, if you enjoy documentaries that trace forgotten history through original records, archaeology, and indigenous testimony, consider subscribing. It genuinely helps, and it lets me keep making investigations like this one, because when John Ray delivered the Inuit account to London, Britain did not thank him. Ray's report was leaked to the press, and the reaction was immediate and furious. The idea that British naval officers, men held up as the very model of discipline and civilization, might have resorted to cannibalism was intolerable to Victorian England. And rather than confront that possibility, the establishment attacked the source. The most influential attack came from Charles Dickens, then the most famous writer in the country. In his weekly magazine, Dickens dismissed the Inuit testimony outright. He argued that no British officer would ever have done such a thing, and he characterized the Inuit informants as unreliable, going so far as to suggest, without any evidence whatsoever, that they themselves might have murdered the survivors. It was, in plain terms, a defense of national honor built on the assumption that indigenous testimony was worthless, and it worked. Ray's reputation never fully recovered. Unlike other Arctic explorers, he received no knighthood. The reward he was eventually granted came with lasting controversy. Lady Franklin campaigned against his account for the rest of her life, promoting instead a heroic version of the expedition's end. Meanwhile, the Inuit kept talking. Over the following decades, searchers who took the trouble to ask, men like the American Charles Francis Hall in the 1860s, and later Frederick Schwatka, collected extensive Inuit testimony. And the accounts were remarkably consistent. The Inuit described ships trapped in ice. They described one vessel that sank in deep water. They described another that drifted south and became accessible. Some accounts described going aboard it, finding a dead man inside, and describing the layout of the vessel in detail. They described it eventually sinking in shallower water near an island further south. They described starving men walking and dying along the coastline. They gave locations. They gave descriptions of masts visible above the ice. They passed these accounts down through generations, and the official searches largely went somewhere else. The dominant reconstruction, built around that single written note, assumed the ships had been abandoned in the ice in 1848 and had simply been crushed and gone down where they were left, far to the northwest. Search effort concentrated there for decades. The Inuit had been saying since the 1850s that at least one ship had ended up much further south. The turning point came from an Inuk historian named Louis Kamukak. Kamukak grew up in Jua Haven, on King William Island, the heart of the Franklin story. As a boy, he heard his great-grandmother describe finding strange objects on the land as a child, items that clearly did not come from Inuit material culture. That story set him on a path he followed for the rest of his life. For decades, Kamukak systematically interviewed elders across the region, collecting and cross-referencing oral accounts of the Franklin expedition. He mapped the traditional Inuit place names, the described locations, the details of the sightings. He compared them against the written record, and he argued consistently and publicly that the oral tradition contained accurate geographic information that searchers had been ignoring. In 2014, a major Canadian-led search operation put that idea to the test, building its search areas around Inuit testimony, including accounts of a ship in the waters off the southern part of the region. On September 2, 2014, sonar found a shipwreck sitting upright in shallow water in eastern Queen Maud Gulf, south of King William Island. It was HMS Erebus, Franklin's own flagship. It was hundreds of kilometers from where the standard reconstruction had long placed it, and it was very close to where Inuit accounts had been indicating for more than a century and a half. 2 years later, in 2016, the second ship was found, and the story of how is almost too on the nose. A member of the search crew, an Inuk man named Sammy Kogvik, mentioned that years earlier, while traveling in the area, he had seen what looked like a wooden mast sticking up out of the sea ice in a bay on the west side of King William Island. He had told few people. The search vessel diverted to check. In Terror Bay, they found HMS Terror, remarkably intact, sitting on the seabed. Both ships, both found in locations consistent with Inuit oral testimony. Both missed for a century and a half by search efforts, built on the assumption that the written record was reliable and the oral one was not. And the harder question, the one that destroyed John Ray's career, was settled too. Beginning in the 1980s, forensic examination of human remains recovered from Franklin sites, bones scattered along the retreat route, found cut marks consistent with the deliberate removal of flesh, and evidence of the breaking of bones for marrow. Later studies confirmed and extended those findings. Ray had reported what the Inuit told him. The Inuit had described what they found, and more than a century later, the physical evidence agreed with both of them. So what do we take from this? The Franklin story is often told as a mystery finally solved by modern technology, by sonar, by underwater archaeology, by well-funded expeditions. And the technology mattered, but the technology only worked once it was pointed in the right direction. And what pointed it was testimony that had been available in detail since 1854. The information was never missing. It was dismissed. It was dismissed because of who was giving it. Dickens' attack on Ray was not an argument about evidence. There was no counter-evidence. It was an assertion that a certain kind of witness could be disregarded, and that assumption shaped where people looked and where they didn't for 170 years. There's a straightforward lesson in that, and it's worth stating plainly, the Inuit were not offering myth. They were offering eyewitness reports and second-hand accounts, carefully transmitted about events in their own territory. Their oral tradition functioned exactly as a historical record is supposed to function. It preserved locations, it preserved details, it survived intact, long enough to be tested, and when it finally was tested, it held up. That matters far beyond the Arctic. Across the world, indigenous oral traditions have been treated as a lesser category of evidence, colorful, culturally interesting, but not the kind of thing you'd base a search grid on. The Franklin case is one of the clearest demonstrations we have that this assumption can be catastrophically expensive. Decades of expeditions, enormous sums of money, lives lost in the searching. All while the answers sat in plain sight, told and retold by people who had watched it happen. Louis Kamukak lived to see both ships found. He died in 2018, having spent his life arguing that the stories of his own people were worth listening to. Today, the wrecks are protected as a National Historic Site, co-managed with Inuit, and Inuit knowledge is formally part of the ongoing research. That is what recognition looks like, arriving about a century and a half late. Franklin's ships are found. But the deeper point of this story isn't about two hulls on the seabed of Queen Maud Gulf. It's about what else we might already know and have already been told and have already decided not to believe. Because the Arctic is not the only place where people have been trying to tell us something for a very long time. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy documentaries that examine forgotten history through original records, archaeology, and indigenous knowledge, consider subscribing. There are more investigations like this on the way. And before you go, I want your thoughts. The Inuit told searchers where the ships were in the 1850s. It took until 2014 to listen. What other historical mysteries do you think might already have an answer sitting in oral tradition, waiting for someone to take it seriously? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you in the next documentary.